Good morning.
Good morning.
So today, the parable that Reverend Elizabeth just read to us is considered the most difficult parable in the New Testament to interpret. And there is no one single universally agreed upon interpretation of this parable. And we get a little window into that by the titles that are put on the parable. So we have the parable of the unjust steward, we have the parable of the shrewd manager, the parable of the dishonest manager, the parable of the foolish master, and the parable of the merciful master. Now, we all know that Jesus walked and Jesus talked, and he was remembered through what we would call oral tradition, and eventually this was written down. And eventually the four evangelists who go by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John took all this material and put all of Jesus's material together. And so when we interpret passages, we get Jesus already through the lens of one of the so-called evangelists. And as you know, hermeneutics is the study of how we interpret things. And there are many ways to look at this most difficult and disagreed upon passage. And one of them is kind of like with a monocle, and you look at just the passage alone. And then there is the way of looking at it as though you were putting on a set of glasses to look at the passage, and one is the passage and the other lens is some form of criticism, which could be literary criticism or historic criticism or source criticism or form. There's all of these, form criticism. And today what I'd like to have us do is use a form known as contextual criticism, which is we look at the passage as it is in the context of the book that it is in. In this case, it's the Gospel according to Luke. And so one lens on the passage and the next lens. Now, the parable before this unusually named parable is the parable that usually goes by the parable of the prodigal son. And the similarities between these two parables is shocking and striking, and there is a long list of them, but let's, for sake of brevity, I'm just going to skip the long list of similarities between these two parables, and I'm going to cut to the chase. So, here we go. Parables are primarily about God, and they're secondarily about people. And so, in the parable of the prodigal son, it's really the parable of the prodigal father who represents God. And in the parable we just had, the parable of the unjust steward, is really about the parable of the merciful master. In each case, the response of the prodigal father and the merciful master is offensive. It's offensive. It's shocking. It not only doesn't make any sense, it is outrageous. Now, we all know the parable of the prodigal son, how the son is audacious. He asks for his father's inheritance before his father is dead, and then he goes off and he loses the inheritance on dissolute living. And when he comes back, the father, who would never do such a thing in antiquity, runs, men did not run in antiquity, runs to meet his son, asks for shoes, puts the royal robe on him, gives him the signet ring so he can sign for the family. They kill the fatted calf and they have this enormous celebration. Super offensive to the oldest son. So now we have this manager, and the manager seems to be a mismanager. Terrible at his job, and if you're the boss, what do you do when you have an employee who's terrible? You let him go. The mismanager panics, faces a dangerous crisis, and then he becomes a dishonest manager, causing his boss to lose a lot of money. It is, by most stretches of the imagination, a sleazy move. But the master comes back and praises him for being shrewd. So, what is the primary point of these parables? The primary point of the parables is to give us insight into what God is like. So, immortal, invisible, God only wise, unknowing. You know, what the heck? How are we to decide what God is like? These parables are pointing us to the divine being that we call God, and they are saying that this God is prodigal in loving and merciful in disposition. That's the point. And we should be the same. Now think about how you think about God. So when I was a boy, I thought God was this enormous accountant in the sky with this absolutely enormous ledger. And I was dumbfounded by God because all day long, God followed everybody and made inputs into this ledger. So if you were good, you got a credit. If you were bad, you got a debit. And that God even saw the little stuff. Incredible God, right? And keeping track of everybody. And religion was about being good. And when the end came, God became a huge judge in the sky. And if you had enough credits, you got into heaven. But if you had too many debits, and you have to remember I grew up a Catholic boy in a small town in upstate New York, you went to purgatory or hell. Oh, it was like a lot for a kid to carry around while they were trying to become a professional athlete. So these parables say something quite different. These parables portray God, yes, keeping score, the prodigal father and the merciful master. They know what's going on, but their response to these roguish characters is completely not reasonable. It's off the chart. It is loving in the sense of divine love. That's what's happening here. Now we can read the Bible as a judgment story, or we can read the Bible as a love story. Now think about this. Love is formative to who you are. So is judgment. Judgment is formative to who you are. So if you grew up in a loving household, the benefits of a loving household are amazing. The not benefits of growing up in a super judgmental household, not so amazing. So I typed in, a little AI work here. What happens if you do not experience love as a child, as a baby? And I'll zip through this. Child attachment disorder, long-term mental and emotional problems, difficulties forming healthy relationships in adulthood, brain development can be negatively impacted. Loving interaction is crucial to forming healthy neural pathways. Lack of love can also affect emotional intelligence, self-esteem, child's ability to self-regulate, leading to chronic trust issues and feeling of never being good enough. So I also believe that most people suffer from the lack of experience of divine love. And by not experiencing divine love, we have spiritual deficiencies that have an enormous impact on our life. So that if we do not experience divine love, it's more difficult for us to connect and to love God if we do not experience God loving us. Also, it's more difficult for us to love our neighbors because we have unlovable neighbors. And if you don't put God between you and your unlovable neighbor, for the most part, it ain't happening. And if we do not experience divine love, we have a lack of ability to truly love ourselves. Now, many of you have heard me speak about this particular vision I had in India because it changed my life, and I'm going to give you the very, very shortened portion of it. The longer version is super cool, but that's not for now. And just say I experienced being a window into the divine dimension and experienced the divine gaze that was penetrating in its love. A love I had never experienced before. I knew not of this kind of love. And I realized when I was having the vision that I did not even love myself. That my love for myself was like a very, very dim light bulb or a piece of cardboard. And that I was not only loved for my personhood, for who I was, not because I did anything, achieved anything, I was just loved for who I was. That I was loved at the cellular level, but not just at the cellular level, at the atomic level, but not just at the atomic level, but the subatomic level, at the level of the protons and the neutrons and the photons and the neurons, and that the very thing, the energy that held those together was divine love. And I realized during the vision how much time I had wasted in my life trying to achieve something so that people would think well of me, trying to be loved, all of that stuff. And I was caught up in the most blissful experience of my life. And while this was happening, I also wished that everybody in the whole world could have this experience. And as I thought about that, I looked at how much hatred there is in the world. I thought about catty energy spent knocking down people. I thought about wars through time. I remember thinking through wars. And I thought about tribes and tribal vilification, finding their identity based on dislike. And I thought about demonizing people who were as loved by the divine as I was loved by the divine. There was nothing special about me. I was just one of the billions of people on the planet. And I thought about this divine love deficit disorder, that it was personal and it was societal. And that the problem with not having experienced love, when someone says to you, well, God loves you, and you go, yeah, that's cool. I got that. But that may be true, but it has no power. It's like a bumper sticker. And that when people act outside the experience of divine love, we can act out of our deficit or our disorder or our darkness, not out of the light of love. Because to be loved by love is to love. It's just what happens. You're loved by love. And it's its own reward and its own joy. And we saw this in the world with the clarity of St. Francis of Assisi, who was God's fool for love. He just experienced that love and he chucked it all. He loved it all. Everything. People, creation. And these parables reveal a divine love of a God who is prodigal and loving, merciful in disposition. And when we are not prodigal and loving and merciful in disposition, we got it wrong. It's the way it is. We got it wrong. Because that's not how God is. So Luke's gospel says more about wealth and poverty than all the other gospels. And what is Luke trying to tell us that Jesus is trying to tell us? And he's trying to tell us that he's warning us. Jesus is warning us that not being prodigal and loving and merciful in disposition is not only wrong, that wealth, which is not bad on its own, right? Jesus is taken care of by wealthy people. He gets his grave from a wealthy man. He's not hammering money per se. What he is hammering is if you look at your life through the monocle of wealth. You're not blinded by the light, you're blinded by the green. And you're blinded from the divine being of God, and you can be blinded from the needs of your neighbor. And this, Jesus hammers away at with a great polemic, because it is not the way the kingdom works. And this parable praises shrewdness, and it praises our shrewdness in dealing with our earthly goods so that through them we may gain heavenly assets. And the word shrewd here can be translated as wisdom. And in other words, he praises us for figuring out how we can use our earthly things so that we might meet not only our family needs, but the needs of the kingdom. And then he says that for this shrewdness, they will welcome you into the eternal homes. Well, it's not super clear who the they are. The they could either be our personified good deeds, so to speak. They could be the people that we helped, or they could be angels. And the biblical commentators believe that Jesus is talking about angels. And a lot to say about angels. I have a great belief in angels. And angels are all over the Bible. Angels are divine, they are divine dimension beings, heavenly beings, who manifest the divine love of God, who remains invisible. They are messengers and manifestors. And Jesus tells us in Luke's gospel, also in Matthew and Mark, that at the resurrection, we will be like angels. This is the greatest phrase that we don't talk enough about. And that what he's saying is basically what we're doing here matters, and we're like angels in training. So wake up to what we're doing. This is, in some sense, all good when we live in the divine flow of love, of light and life and love.